ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook.
The sun beat down hard on the small desert town of Dry Creek, its rays slicing through the dry air like a blade, scorching everything in its path. The wind had kicked up a cloud of dust that swirled around the streets, and the old wooden buildings creaked under the weight of the heat. Most of the town's folks were inside, hiding from the scorching sun, nursing their drinks at the local saloon, or sitting on the shaded porches of their homes. But outside, where the world seemed to have melted under the relentless heat, stood a man who had no use for shelter. Maddox, a rancher with the calluses of hard work and the stubbornness of someone who had seen more than his fair share of struggles, stood at the edge of his property. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced out over the land. He'd worked this land since he could remember, raised in the rough ways of the desert, with little more than the wind and dust to keep him company. He had no room in his life for anything or anyone that might complicate matters. He had cattle to tend to, fences to fix, and a ranch to keep going. In his mind he was set. Then she appeared. The sound of hooves broke through the stillness of the day, and Maddox turned toward the sound. It wasn't unusual for someone to come to his ranch for help, but this was different. She wasn't like the usual town folk, the ones who came for a handout or a bit of friendly gossip. No, this was a woman who seemed like she had a purpose, a woman who had been shaped by something far harsher than the blistering sun. Her horse kicked up a cloud of dust behind her as she rode toward him, the leather of her saddle creaking as she slowed to a stop. She was dressed in a simple brown frock that had seen better days. Her hair, tied back in a messy knot, blew in the wind, but it was her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. They were hard, like a person who had seen too much and learned that softness would only get you hurt. She looked down at him, her gaze steady, unflinching. "You're Maddox, ain't you?" she asked, her voice rough from the desert air, but not from fear. "I am," he replied, his voice low and steady. She dismounted and walked toward him, her boots kicking up more dust. "I need you to do something for me," she said, her gaze fixed on his. Maddox raised an eyebrow. "What could a woman like you want from a man like me?" She gave him a sharp look, one that cut through the layers of cynicism that Maddox had built over the years. "I ain't here for charity," she said. "I need a husband, fast." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A husband. For a moment Maddox thought he misheard her, but there was no mistaking it. The desperation in her voice was clear, and her eyes told him that she was telling the truth. She needed this. Desperation had a way of sharpening a person's focus, and right now, she was laser-focused on him. "Why me?" Maddox asked, his brow furrowing. She glanced down, then back up at him. "I've got a lot of people looking for me. People I owe. I can't outrun them anymore. I need someone who won't ask questions." Maddox looked her over again, his mind racing. A stranger, a woman with a rough look about her standing on his land, asking for a marriage of convenience. It didn't sit right, but something about her, something about the way she carried herself told him that she wasn't lying. She was running from something, or someone. "Why don't you just find another man in town?" he asked, his voice gruff, though a part of him wondered why he even cared. "I've tried," she said, stepping closer to him, "but they want something more than I can give. They don't want a woman who knows how to survive. They want someone they can own. I'm not that woman." Her words hit a nerve. Maddox had met plenty of women in his life, but none of them had ever spoken with such raw honesty, and none of them had ever seemed to care so little for what people thought of them. She paused for a moment, letting her words hang in the air before adding, "I'm offering you $10,000 to marry me. No questions asked. You stand beside me, and no one in town will ask why." Maddox stood there stunned. He had heard of money, of course. It was the lifeblood of any man trying to make a living in the West. But $10,000, that was a small fortune. Enough to buy land, cattle and a future. Enough to change everything. But there was more to it. There was the weight of her words, the desperation in her eye. This wasn't about money for her. This was about survival. And in the desert, survival was everything. "I ain't asking for nothing from you, Maddox," she said, breaking his thoughts. "Just a piece of paper, and after that you can go on with your life and I'll go on with mine. No strings attached." Maddox considered her offer for a long moment. The idea of a wife, a woman to share his life with, seemed almost absurd. He had never pictured himself getting married. Hell, he'd never pictured himself sharing a roof with anyone, let alone a woman who needed him for protection, not affection. But something about her stirred something inside him, something buried deep within him, that he didn't know he had. Maybe it was her bluntness, maybe it was the way she seemed to know exactly who she was and exactly what she needed. Or maybe it was the fact that in a town full of people trying to be something they weren't, she was the only one who seemed to be telling the truth. "I don't know," Maddox said, his hand instinctively reaching for the reins of his horse. "I don't make deals like that." Her gaze never wavered. "I'm not asking you to be a hero, Maddox. I'm asking you to keep me alive." The silence stretched between them, the sound of the wind the only thing filling the space. Finally, Maddox spoke again. $10,000, huh? She nodded. "It's yours. Just say the word." Maddox looked out at the horizon, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the land. It seemed like the whole world had gone quiet. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Everything he knew, everything he had believed about his life was suddenly in question. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he didn't know if he could say no either. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "You've got yourself a deal." Maddox wasn't sure what he had just agreed to, but there was no turning back now. The deal had been made. He stood there, with the desert wind blowing through his hair, and the taste of dust in his mouth, watching the woman mount her horse again. Her movements were deliberate, measured, like someone who had learned to survive by never showing too much of themselves. Her eyes, still fierce, flicked over him one last time before she spurred her horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up a cloud of dust as it began to trot back toward town. He stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of what he had just agreed to settling heavily on his chest. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that he had just made a marriage pact with a woman who seemed to be running from something dark, or the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't just about the money. This wasn't just about surviving. No, there was something more beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He glanced down at the land stretching out before him, as if the barren earth could provide him with the answers he sought. It did, but as he turned to walk back to the small ranch house, his mind kept wandering back to her, her quiet desperation, the way she had stood before him with nothing but raw honesty. She wasn't pretty, not in the way the women from the city were, but there was something about her, something that pulled at him in ways he couldn't understand. The promise of $10,000 was tempting enough to make him agree to the marriage, but the silence between them, the unspoken tension in her voice, it made him uneasy. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Maddox went through the motions, tending to his cattle and checking on the fences, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman. Clara. She had introduced herself as Clara, a name that sounded like a lie. Wrapped in dust and hardship, he hadn't seen her again since that first meeting. She had made it clear that she wanted to keep their arrangement between the two of them, a deal made in silence. There had been no talk of love or affection, only survival and protection. She had asked for a marriage, a paper contract to shield her from whatever she was running from, and he had agreed. No promises, no false pretenses, just a legal agreement. But even with that in mind, Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about keeping her safe. The way she looked at him, the way she spoke to him, there was more beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what it was, but he was beginning to feel that he might be getting more than he bargained for. As the days passed, he prepared for the wedding. The preacher from town had agreed to perform the ceremony, though he seemed as confused as Maddox about the circumstances. The other townsfolk, however, weren't quite as perplexed. Word spread quickly in Dry Creek, and it wasn't long before Maddox was receiving curious glances from the men at the saloon and knowing smiles from the women at the market. None of them understood the nature of his arrangement with Clara, but they didn't need to. In their eyes, he had struck a deal with a woman who had a reputation for being on the run. Maddox couldn't blame them. He had never been one to share his business with the town, but the eyes of the people were always watching, always gossiping, and he had learned long ago that in Dry Creek, nothing remained a secret for long. The morning of the wedding arrived, and as he stood at the front of the small chapel waiting for Clara to arrive, he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation gnawing at his inside. He had expected the day to feel like any other, a simple formality, but now that it was here, Now that the moment was upon him, it felt like the world was holding its breath. The wind whistled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the chapel as Maddox waited. His boots scraped across the floor as he shifted from one foot to the other. It wasn't nerves, it was something deeper, a premonition that he couldn't shake. The door to the chapel creaked open, and Clara stepped inside. She wasn't what Maddox had expected. In the harsh light of the chapel, her face looked softer, less guarded. Her frufrake, once worn and dusty, had been cleaned and pressed. Her hair, usually tied back in a hasty knot, had been carefully arranged in loose curls. She still wasn't a beauty by conventional standards, but there was a quiet strength in her that made her stand out in a way no polished woman from the town ever could. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply existing unashamed of who she was. Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was no one else in the room. It was just the two of them, two strangers who had entered this agreement for reasons neither could fully explain. "You ready?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Maddox nodded, though the words felt like they were stuck in his throat. He didn't know what to say. What could he say to a woman who had just walked into his life, asking for something he hadn't planned to give? The preacher cleared his throat, signaling the start of the ceremony. Clara and Maddox exchanged one last glance before turning toward him, ready to make the deal official. The preacher's voice filled the room, but Maddox wasn't really listening. His thoughts were miles away, caught between the weight of the commitment he was about to make and the realization that something much deeper than a simple contract was at play here. As the preacher spoke the words that would make them man and wife, Maddox's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the money. He wasn't even thinking about the future. All he could think about was the way Clara had looked at him, like she needed something more than a piece of paper, more than a legal agreement. When the preacher finally finished, he turned to them both, waiting for them to say their vows. Clara's voice was steady, but Maddox could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't nervous, she was waiting for something, and Maddox realized, with a jolt, that he was waiting for the moment that would reveal the truth of why she needed this, why she had chosen him. "I do," Clara said softly, her eyes not leaving Maddox's. Maddox felt a lump form in his throat as he repeated the words, "I do." The ceremony was over, the vows had been spoken, and in that moment, Maddox realized that his life had just been irrevocably changed. But what he didn't know yet, what he couldn't understand, was just how deeply this woman, this marriage of convenience, would come to stir something within him, something he hadn't even known exist. Maddox stood outside the chapel, staring out into the vast desert, stretching before him. The sun had nearly set, casting an orange glow over the horizon. The air had cooled, but the heaviness of the moment clung to him like the dust in his. He had just married a woman he barely knew, someone who had asked him for help under the cover of silence and desperate promises. And now, as he stood there, his heart felt like a stranger in his chest. Clara had disappeared into the small church after the ceremony, retreating to whatever world she came from before she had stumbled into his life. She had given her vows, agreed to a future with him, but something in her eyes, something in the way she had looked at him as they sealed the deal, still unsettled him. She wasn't just a woman running from the law. She was someone carrying a burden that had been weighing her down for years. Maddox wasn't a fool. He could tell when someone was hiding something, and Clara was hiding something big. Her every movement was calculated, guarded. She hadn't spoken a word of her past, and Maddox knew better than to ask. The silence between them was thick with the unspoken truth that neither one of them was truly free. That evening, after the ceremony, Clara and Maddox sat together at the dinner table inside his ranch house. The food was simple, as it always was for him: cornbread, beans, and roasted. Clara hadn't made any attempt to dress up for the occasion. She wore the same frig she had on when she arrived, as though the simple act of putting on a new outfit wouldn't make a difference. She didn't speak much as they ate, and neither did he. The air was thick with tension, each of them trying to figure out how to navigate this new, uncomfortable reality. Clara's gaze was steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she ate. Maddox couldn't help but notice the way her fingers trembled slightly, as if her body was still adjusting to the enormity of what they had just done. But she was silent, calm even. Her composure was something to admire, something that reminded him of the way the desert looked at dusk. Beautiful, but with a certain coldness that made it dangerous. So Maddox said finally, breaking the silence, "What happens now?" Clara's eyes met his, and for a split second, Maddox thought he saw something flicker in them, something vulnerable, something that hadn't been there before, but it was gone before he could pinpoint it. "You go back to your ranch," Clara said. "I'll stay here for a while, until things settle down." "Things?" Maddox asked, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a long drink from her cup, her eyes never leaving his. She seemed to weigh her words before she spoke again, careful, like she was trying to keep something locked inside. "People are looking for me," she finally said. "People I owe, people who would rather see me dead than alive. I need to lay low for a while." Maddox felt the weight of her words sink into him. The promise she had made to him when she offered him the $10,000 hadn't been about the money, it had been about survival. Her survival, her survival. "Who are they?" Maddox asked, his voice softer now. "Who are you running from?" Clara shook her head, her jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter," she said curtly. "What matters is that we made a deal, and now you keep your end of it." The finality in her voice made him pause. He wanted to press further, to ask what had driven her to this point, to demand more answers, but he knew better than to push her. She was a woman who had learned to protect herself, and Maddox was no fool. He knew when to back off. The next few days passed in relative silence. Clara settled into the small guest room in the back of the house, keeping to herself during the day. Maddox kept his distance, but he noticed the way she would occasionally wander outside, as though searching for something she couldn't find. She spent most of her time cleaning the house, cooking meals, and doing the small chores that needed to be done. She was efficient, almost mechanical in her movements, like a woman who had learned how to stay busy in order to keep the world at bay. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the room, and Maddox would catch a flicker of something in her expression, something deep, something hidden. It was almost like she was trying to figure him out just as much as he was trying to figure her out. Maddox couldn't deny the effect she was having on him. There was something magnetic about her, something that pulled at the strings of his own hidden emotions. He had always prided himself on being a man who didn't need anyone, who didn't have time for soft attachments. But Clara was different. She wasn't soft. She wasn't looking for affection or sympathy. She was looking for survival, and somehow, despite the distance she kept, despite the walls she had built, Maddox felt himself drawn to her. It wasn't love, not yet, anyway, but there was something between them, something that neither of them could deny. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with deep purples and pinks, Maddox found himself outside, cleaning his rifle. The air was cool now, the desert's harshness softened by the evening's embrace. Clara was sitting on the porch, a few steps away, her legs drawn up to her chest as she stared out at the land before her. Maddox finished with his rifle and stood, watching her for a moment. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation hanging between them. He knew he should leave her be, that the space between them was something she needed, but something inside him urged him forward. He took a step toward her. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "What is it, Maddox?" He hesitated, unsure of what he was about to say. "You're not just running from the law, are you?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the dirt beneath her feet as though weighing the decision to speak. When she finally looked up, her eyes were harder than ever. "You don't need to know the details, Maddox. Just know that I'm here because I have nowhere else to go, and you're the only one who can keep me safe." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Maddox knew that she was still holding back, still keeping her secrets close to her chest. But something about the way she said it so bluntly, so matter-of-fact, told him that the danger she was running from was much worse than he could imagine. And for the first time since she had entered his life, Maddox felt a sense of protectiveness stirring inside him. "I'll keep you safe," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Clara studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something vulnerable crossed her face. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time, Maddox wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the protection, or for something deeper. The days had started to blur together. The desert stretched out beyond the small ranch house like a never-ending sea of sand, the horizon a constant reminder that the world outside their little bubble was harsh and unforgiving. But inside the house, a strange peace had settled between Maddox and Clara. There were no more questions, no more desperate bargains, just the quiet hum of routine. Clara had settled into the role of a quiet housemate, taking care of the small chores around the ranch, cooking meals and offering little conversation. But every now and then, Maddox would catch her staring off into the distance, her expression far away, as though she were trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. Maddox had never been one to pry. He knew better than to force someone to open up before they were ready. But the silence between them was starting to feel like a weight, something that neither of them could shake. He needed to know more about her. He needed to understand the woman he had agreed to marry, not just for his own sake, but for hers as well. The shadows of her past were beginning to creep into the present, and Maddox could feel the tension building between them, like a storm on the horizon. Maddox had just finished checking on the cattle and was walking back to the house, when he noticed Clara standing near the edge of the property. She wasn't looking at him, but staring out at the distant hills, her body rigid, as if waiting for something or he had learned to leave her alone when she was like this. But something about the way she stood there so still made him uneasy. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Clara," he called softly, his boots crunching on the dry earth beneath him. She turned her head toward him, but didn't fully face him. There was something about the way she looked at him that told him she wasn't quite here with him. "I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "You've kept your end of the deal." But Maddox stopped a few feet from her, watching her carefully. He could feel the walls she had built around herself, the distance she kept. But this was different. She wasn't just keeping secrets now, she was on the verge of revealing something. "But," he prodded gently. Clara's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Maddox thought she might shut down again. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled slowly and began to speak. "I didn't come to you for protection just from the law," she said quietly. "I'm running from something far worse. And it's not just a group of men I owe, it's the man I used to call my husband." Maddox blinked, the words landing on him like a hammer blow. He had known there was more to her story, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the weight of it in her voice, hit him harder than he had expected. "Your husband," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes flickered to the ground and she seemed to shrink in on herself, as though the very mention of him caused her to become smaller, weaker. But she didn't look away. She didn't shy away from the truth. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "His name was Thomas Westbrook." Clara paused, her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them together in front of her. "Thomas was a good man at first. But that man doesn't exist anymore. He became someone I didn't recognize. He became a monster." Maddox stepped closer, his heart heavy with something he couldn't quite name. He had never expected her to open up like this. Not so soon, not after everything she had been through. But here she was, unraveling before him, telling him a story that was darker than anything he could have imagined. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough, but gentle. Clara's lips trembled, and for a moment, Maddox thought she might break down in front of him, but she didn't. Instead, she stood tall, her back straight as though she were preparing for a battle. "Thomas was a gambler, a drinker. He'd spend our money on cards, on whiskey. He'd come home drunk, angry, and lash out. But it wasn't just the money he wasted, it was the way he started making deals with the wrong people, dangerous people. And when I tried to leave, when I tried to escape," Clara's voice faltered, and her eyes dropped to the ground, the weight of the memory pressing down on her like a boulder. Maddox's fists clenched at his side. He didn't need to hear more. He could see it in her face, feel it in the way her body had tensed when she spoke about him. He knew what kind of man Thomas Westbrook had been, and he knew that Clara's past wasn't something she could outrun so easily. "I tried to protect myself, protect my life, but Thomas didn't care. He went after my family, tried to use them to get to me, and when that didn't work, he came after me himself." Her voice trailed off, and Maddox could see the pain in her eyes, the haunted look that told him just how close she had come to losing everything. "And why didn't you go to the law?" Maddox asked, his voice harsh. "Why didn't you just tell someone?" Clara shook her head, her eyes distant. "You don't understand, Maddox. The law in towns like Dry Creek is always bought. I couldn't trust anyone. Thomas had connections. He made sure that the people in charge wouldn't help me." Maddox's mind raced. The realization of what she was telling him began to settle in like a stone in his gut. Clara hadn't been running from the law. She had been running from the people who had once controlled her life, and Thomas Westbrook, the man she had married, had been the puppet master, pulling the strings. What happened to him? Maddox asked, quietly, knowing the answer before the words even left his mouth. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes dark with the memory. I left him. I had to. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to get away. I didn't know where to go, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay there. He was going to kill me. She let the silence hang between them for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. Then, in a softer voice, she added, I don't know if he's dead, Maddox, but I do know that the men he ran with are still looking for me. Maddox's mind spun as he took in the full weight of her story. Clara wasn't just a woman running from the law. She was a woman running for her life. A woman who had been broken and scarred by a man she once loved. But as the sun set behind them, casting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Maddox felt something stir inside him. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about something deeper, something primal. He wasn't about to let anyone harm her. He wasn't about to let the shadows of her past follow her into the present. I'll keep you safe, he said, his voice firm, the promise hanging between them like an unbreakable vow. No matter what it takes. Clara looked up at him, her eyes softening for the first time since they had met. Thank you, Maddox. For the first time, Maddox saw her without the walls, without the secrets. She was just a woman scared, strong, and doing what she had to in order to survive. And in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was something stronger, something that bound them together in a way neither of them could fully understand. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted with deep purples and soft blues, the kind of beauty that only the desert could provide at dusk. Maddox sat on the porch of the ranch house, his back against the wooden beams, staring out at the vast expanse of land that stretched out before him. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled in the web of Clara's past, the secrets she had revealed, and the promise he had made to protect. But the reality of the situation was beginning to settle in like a heavy weight on his chest. Clara had come into his life as a stranger, a woman who needed a husband to protect her from the shadows of her past. But now, after everything she had shared, Maddox knew that there was no simple answer to the question of what would happen next. Clara had been running for so long, hiding from the man she had once loved, from the people who had once controlled her life, and now, they were closing in on them both. He heard the door creak open behind him, and he didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Clara had been quiet for the last few days, withdrawn and distant, lost in her thoughts as she tried to process the gravity of what had happened. But tonight, there was a difference in the way she approached him, a sense of resolve that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Maddox, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. He turned toward her, his eyes meeting her. There was something in her gaze now, something that spoke of the struggle she had been carrying on her own, but there was also strength that had been buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. Clara, Maddox said, his voice low, his eyes searching her. What's going on? She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. I don't think we can stay here any longer. Maddox's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment would come, had known that sooner or later, Clara's past would catch up with them. But hearing her say it out loud, seeing the truth in her eyes, made it real. The danger wasn't just out there anymore. It was here, and it was closing in fast. Clara's words hung in the air, heavy with the reality of the situation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The desert seemed to hold its breath as the silence stretched between them, as if the land itself were waiting for the next move. We can't run forever, Maddox said, his voice steady, and I'm not going to let them come for you, not while I'm still breathing. Clara's eyes softened for a brief moment, and then she nodded. I know, but they won't stop. They'll keep coming, Maddox, and I don't know how much longer we can outrun them. Maddox stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. Then we'll fight back. Clara's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say that. Fight. Maddox, you don't understand. These men, Thomas's men, they're not like the others. They're ruthless. They don't care about the law, about what's right. They'll burn everything down to get to me. Maddox stepped closer, his expression hardening. I don't care who they are. If they want a fight, then they'll get one. You've been running long enough, Clara. It's time we made our stand. There was a fire in Maddox's voice now, something deep and primal that stirred within him. He wasn't just protecting a woman anymore. He wasn't just keeping his promise. He was standing up for something that mattered, for someone who mattered, and he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how dangerous, take that away from him. Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, Maddox thought she might back down. But then, to his surprise, she stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. You don't know what you're getting into, she said, her voice quiet but steady. You're talking about going after men who won't hesitate to kill you. They'll come for both of us, and they won't stop until we're dead. Maddox's eyes locked onto hers, and he saw the fear there. He saw the woman who had been broken, the woman who had seen too much, but he also saw something else. He saw the woman who had survived, who had fought for her life when no one else would, and he knew, deep down, that she wasn't going to back down from this fight. I know exactly what I'm getting into, he said, his voice rough, and I don't care. We'll face them together. We'll end this, once and for all. But no matter how much he prepared, the feeling in his gut told him that nothing would be enough. Nothing could prepare them for the storm that was coming. Clara was a quiet presence during those days, moving through the house with a sense of purpose, but her eyes never left the horizon. Maddox had never seen her like this, calm, almost too calm, as though she were already bracing herself for the inevitable. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Clara joined him outside. She had a look in her eyes, one that told him she was ready for whatever came next. Maddox, she said, her voice low but firm, I'm not asking you to die for me. I'm not asking you to throw away everything you've built here, but I'm asking you to help me fight back. If we don't, if we just run again, we'll never stop running. Maddox turned to face her, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He had never been one to fight for anything other than survival. But this was different. He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. I'm not running anymore, he said, his voice strong. We're in this together. And with that, they made their plan. They would face the men who had terrorized Clara's life. They would fight back against the ghosts of her past, and they would do it on their terms. The night that followed was quiet, the desert eerily still as Maddox and Clara prepared for what was to come. They had gathered their supplies, packed their weapons, and fortified the house as best they could. But even as they sat together by the fire, the sense of dread lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Clara sat beside him, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought, but Maddox could see the resolve in her posture. She was ready. They both were. They'll be here by morning, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maddox nodded, his hand resting on the rifle beside him. He had no illusions about what was coming. They were about to face a group of ruthless men, men who had already shown they were willing to kill without hesitation. But Maddox wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The night passed slowly, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. And when the first light of dawn broke over the desert, Maddox knew that the time had come. The storm was finally here. They moved quickly, their hearts beating in sync as they prepared for the battle ahead. Clara had taken her position by the window, her rifle steady in her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon. Maddox stood beside her, his own rifle ready, his mind focused on the task at hand. The sound of hooves broke the silence, and Clara's eyes narrowed. The men were coming. Maddox gave her one last glance, and then they both stepped into the storm. Evil. The first shot rang out, loud and sharp, cutting through the air like a crack of thunder. Maddox's heart raced as he fired back, his aim steady, his movements fluid. Clara was beside him, every bit as determined, every bit as deadly as he was. The men who had come for her didn't stand a chance. The battle raged on, the sound of gunfire echoing across the desert, but Maddox and Clara fought side by side, their connection stronger than ever. This was their moment, their stand, and they weren't going to let anyone take it from them. When the dust finally settled, the men who had once threatened Clara's life were lying in the dirt, defeated. The ranch was still standing, and so were they.